War's part of the human experience. There were millions of Germans suffering from lack of food and just dying.
Is that why they were able to recover and develop so quickly? Because they had strong pre-war institutions and also access to financing?
You look at Korea, it took them 30 years. They were our ally, but they were a dictatorship. Embargoes can work in the short run because they're disruptive. I see a lot of potential in a post-war Russia. I think Russia has certain strengths, and I think these strengths can be reinforced.
What happens to a country's economy once war is broken out?
Oh, yeah. So war ruins the economy. I mean, it ruins a lot of people, and it ruins the economy as well. It lowers the economy and in a permanent way. We are seeing several countries in the world downgraded by the World Bank from what's called lower middle income to low income.
Hmm.
And actually, that is predominant movement of countries in recent years. Yes, and it's almost always associated with civil strife to outright war.
Okay, interesting. And obviously, in your article, you mentioned a lot of this stuff, but give me a background on what war is defined as in your article, because I imagine the effects would obviously be a lot different if it's, something like the recent 12-day war of Iran comparison to like World War II. Those are quite big scale. So how do you define war in like a lot of these examples?
So the people on whom I rely for measuring war use a body count approach. So in one database, it's as few as 25 battle deaths per year. And that gets countries like Honduras into the database, where they had a repressive regime that disappeared citizens.
Oh, okay.
And then we have a rather tough nut here, uh, 1,000 battle deaths per year. And so, depending on what you want to do with these numbers, you could go with one or the other, or maybe you could relate the number of battle deaths to the size of the countries involved. Another concern I have about these measures is in the advanced democracies of the world, we have a lot of investment in rescuing wounded soldiers. They would have showed up as dead in the past, and now they showed up as injured, in many cases, severely injured. So, like we in the United States, from our escapades in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 20 years, we have a lot of badly injured veterans who would, in prior wars, be dead.
Hmm.
And so how do you make an adjustment for that? So now I went with a judgment call for the work that we're going to tap into, where the researchers scaled the war using judgment as to how big they were relative to the countries involved.
Right, I see. Yeah, because that's quite kind of like a broad definition, isn't it? If you're, not that I don't have their relative impacts, but if you have, the kind of high casualty rates of sort of more sort of structured wars, World War II, Vietnam, all this kind of stuff, and then compared to some of these other sort of maybe Honduras, almost like domestic sort of governmental
Right.
operations. I almost don't know how you would define it, I guess. So it's quite a
Right.
broad consensus.
How do you measure the transition, if you will, from these low-level civil
Oh,
strife,
right. Yeah, that's a good
which
point as
aren't
well. Yeah.
low level if you're involved, um, to outright, global war?
Yeah, right. I mean, that's quite a big distinction, I would say.
Yes.
So once a country's economy, once a war is broken out, what are typically the mechanisms that a country has to initiate, whether that be financing, government, requisitioning, supply chain? What are the typical things that they have to do in order to adapt to this new state of affairs, essentially?
Right. So, in a lot of countries, it's very difficult to finance a war.
Hmm.
You, put in, say, tax increases, and you're pushing people away, from the government. So many times you're limited by how to finance a war, to borrowing when you can, and to just printing up the money. So often in a war, you have a debt and you have inflationary finance.
Okay, interesting. So you're either sort of increasing the money supply by various means. Are you buying war bonds in a lot of instances, or are you getting loans from like the IMF or I guess whoever?
Yes, now talking about an advanced democracy like the United States during World War II, we encouraged a lot of buying of war bonds. In fact, several policies come together. We restricted what you could buy through rationing, and yet we encouraged people to work a lot,
Hmm,
like families that were not together. The husband was overseas and the wife at home. Not to have, they couldn't make children, and we encouraged the women involved here to go into the factories. So they were showing good income,
hmm,
but by reason of rationing, there was nothing to spend the money on.
hmm,
So there was encouragement to buy war bonds. And so there's often these several mechanisms. Even with those, there was a lot of borrowing and a lot of inflationary finance that for a time was suppressed by price controls. But there's a limit to what you can do that way. Now, looking at countries that aren't so uh, well developed as the advanced democracies of the world, yeah, you rather quickly go from the policies such as I've just described, some amount of taxes, some amount of borrowing, some amount of inflation, some suppression of inflation by price controls, and some effectively forcing people to save through rationing. Instead, you rather quickly get to just inflationary finance, to black markets, and to to a ruined economy.
hmm. Yeah, I guess it depends on how the general confidence in the country and the strength of their institutions probably plays like a big role in that. So going and just feeding straight into the research and the article that you were involved with, what kind of data are you pulling to assess these effects on economic growth of these kind of, depending on how you define these wartime periods? What data sets are you and what information are
Yes.
you looking at?
So I wanted to conduct a we'll call it a sophisticated econometric study, and what I mean here by sophisticated, one that accounts explicitly for the trendedness in economic data. By this trendedness, I mean over relatively short periods of time, any economic time series variable is going to be correlated with any other. They're just trended, and the computer will pick up that shared trend. So we are aware of this problem in econometrics, and we have techniques to deal with it nowadays, developed by Clive Granger from England, by Christopher Sims from the United States, and other such researchers, including my co-author. Yeah, he was instrumental in the development of these techniques. So it abstracts from the trendedness of economic variables. It looks at the innovations
Hmm,
or the surprises in variables. And what it looks for is whether the surprises in this variable are related to either the current or past surprises in another variable. And that's our rather demanding approach to data today. It was a lot easier to do econometrics 20, 40, or 60 years ago. You could do it on a piece of graph paper with your eyes, do the eyeball regression. Today, you just have to go into a computer. I knew when I sent my article in for peer review, it was going to come back. You have to do the econometrics correctly. And so I asked my mentor back at Boston College to help me on this. And yeah, it was easy pie. And the results I got are very persuasive. You'd have to be pig headed. I'll quote Chris Sims. You have to be pig headed to deny these results.
fair enough. Then what specific data sets are you using? Are you looking at GDP data? Are you looking at growth data? Are you looking at consumption?
So for war, I'm using data sets like the correlates of war, which has been pushed back to 1816, and the UCDP PRIO data set, which goes back to 1946. I'm using a data set from George Washington University here in Washington, D.C., and it involves this judgment called the Center for Systemic Peace, and they tracked war, the intensity of the war relative to the countries involved. And they also did political coups, coups, um, as that has been found by a lot of researchers to also affect GDP growth. Now, what I found, wars permanently lower the economy and coups only temporarily. There's a bounce back with a coup. So the
Interesting.
effect of war is in the destruction of people as well as physical capital, and not only in people in terms of killing them and wounding them, but also in terms of destroying social capital, the connections that people have with each other, how willing they are to specialize in trade, to join into businesses, and to make investments. So, yes. Now, if you think about it, the GDP stats are biased in favor of war. There's no discount of GDP for destroying something,
Hmm.
but building its replacement counts. Or
Yeah.
you think of the ghost cities in China, under populated cities. There's no discount of GDP for underpopulation
Yeah,
because it's
GDP.
based on cost only.
Yeah, GDP is a really interesting one. I mean, like, there's there's like an infamy and a range of various jokes and stuff about GDP and like how it can essentially be manipulated. I was thinking about this relatively recently, actually, because yeah, as you mentioned there, with some of that construction element in China, but also when I look at things like uh, pharmacy benefit managers in the US, um, there are certain activities that don't necessarily add value, but intrinsically, but can essentially inflate like GDP figures. And then you've got places like, I think the GDP per capita of Ireland, I think, is like $100,000 a year. But now, obviously, in terms of relativeness to the UK, I don't think the average Irish person is twice as rich as the average
Well, we don't
Brit.
have Irish people migrating to England any longer.
No, no, no,
They
no. I
used
mean,
to be a source of cheap labor.
no, 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 certainly, certainly. But it's made me think a lot about whether a lot of these metrics that we use, whether GDP is the big one,
Right, right.
whether like how accurate they really are. And I'm wondering, actually, do you have any views on if there are any better metrics or better ways that we can assess an economy on different?
What I would like to do, but I don't have to, is to decrement GDP by the destruction occurring during war. In other words, write down GDP for the loss of humans and human capital when that happens, and for the bombing
Right.
of infrastructure and privately owned uh, productive facilities and residences. Boy, that would make the figures way bigger than what I have, wouldn't it?
Hmm. Yeah, because like I say, it doesn't. If you bomb a factory, it doesn't necessarily take into account the loss of capital and the reinvestment opportunities that you have to do for all those things.
Right.
And on those areas though, and I think you outline this in the article, that post-war recovery is not uniform across economies. It really is significantly affected by the strength of pre-war institutions and access to finance and capital post-war in particular.
Right. Right.
And I start to think about World War II in this regard, where you have two sort of quote unquote losers, Japan and Germany, who, like I say, quote unquote, lost those wars, obviously, depending on how you define it, obviously. But since then have come to be two of the largest industrial economy bases in the world. larger than the UK, and some others who, quote unquote, won the war. And it kind of makes you think about, to those points, is that why they were able to recover and develop so quickly? Because they had strong pre-war institutions and also access to financing post-war. Let's say in comparison to the Treaty of Versailles after World War One, where it was very punitive and necessary for like
Yeah.
Germany to have to rebuild.
So we kind of overlearned that lesson. We, the United States, some of us, they're called the neocons, neoconservatives, thought, yeah, all you have to do is win the war, have a regime change, have an election or two, and then these will be the new Germany or the new Japan,
Hmm.
or the new Korea or the new Taiwan, or the new Italy, losers of past wars that are doing fine. No, the majority of instances of regime change are followed by other repressive regimes, are followed by disasters. So we in the United States, yeah, we love George Washington. What we brought in a government that helped us to establish democracy and market-oriented economy, and yeah, that's why we've had a success. And we could say the same thing about let's say let's say Germany with the introduction of Adenauer and others there who were instrumental. Now, it might be because they lost so bad that they embraced change. And then we Americans, we love Emperor Hirohito, now passed away. Yes, I know that he was uh, okay with the militarists, maybe had to be. That's a complex issue. But we think our General MacArthur was just the right guy. He's bestrode the planet like a god and worked with the emperor. And again, this might have been they'd lost really badly, and so we're open to change. Now you look at Korea, it took them 30 years. They were our ally, but they were a dictatorship until after 30 years, the people changed. Maybe if we had stayed in Afghanistan 30 years, right? We just got out prematurely. We only stayed there 20 years. But
Yeah, I mean, it's a dicey game on that front in terms of like
right,
choosing how
but
long
w
to
w
and
in
regime
terms of
change.
a post-war recovery, here's what I'll say. What we call progress is mostly the, consolidation of random gains.
Hmm.
It's sorta like, you know, the main part of our theory of evolution. Um, Things happen randomly, but what survives? It's the survival of the fittest. So if we could do that, if we can consolidate our gains, and right now, we have Germany and Italy, as well as the democracies prior to World War II, we incorporated them into NATO. Then we moved the borders of NATO to the east, incorporating the former communist countries like Poland. And now there's a big controversy about Ukraine. Is that too far? Is this the bridge too far?
Hmm.
Like Montgomery during World War II?
Yeah, no, certainly.
And so I respect differences of opinion about that.
No, no, I think it's an interesting combo. I think from what I gather, at least from doing sort of like my sort of own sort of research and stuff on it, it seems so dependent on a multitude of factors. Um, why economies can, you know,
Right, right.
continue to grow and develop. I think, because you have this case in, like, for example, South Korea versus North Korea. Now, obviously, those countries have grown vastly differently apart. Now, obviously, South Korea had a lot of backing from the States because of for geopolitical reasons to make sure it developed. But it within, like you say, in a span of 30, 40 years, they've gone from a incredibly poor country to an incredibly wealthy country. That's almost speed running of the sort of even the issues that developed countries face when you look at things like aging demographics and aging populations and all those kind of things. And then when you look at Japan and Germany, for an example. I think certainly the destruction obviously is bad from industrial point of view, but it does allow you to rebuild in a way, particularly if you have access to low cost financing, which America is able to provide sort of post war. And obviously the cultures of Japan and Germany are quite industrious by nature, I think. So I think it's the culture also kind of affects these things as well. But it is interesting to see the differences in a lot of the examples. What makes a Vietnam different to a South Korea, for example. Um, can you give me an example of a post-war economy that just hasn't been able to recover nearly to the same level as maybe we've seen from Japan, Germany, and South Korea?
Okay, so um, here's what happens in terms of recovery. The trend is that countries grow in proportion to their economic freedom. So you take a country like Singapore, once it gains its independence from Malaysia. There was a region that was devastated during World War II. And the Singapore part, in part because of their pride in being Singapore, they were able to embark on a period of rapid economic growth. Also, because they're just a little country, they know they can't be protectionist. They know they have to be an open economy, and so that kind of forces them
Hmm.
to be committed to a market-oriented economy. Now, you mentioned Vietnam. Vietnam is kind of a quiet success story. They allow non-communists to run for their national legislature, their parliament, if you will. Now, you have to kind of agree with socialism, but you don't have to be a member of the party. And they're called independents, and we see some elections of them. And so I sometimes wonder, is peace a way to move ahead? Like in the case of Vietnam, if it took Korea 30 years, maybe it's going to take Vietnam as long or longer. Could we be patient? And I think with progress, we can be patient. So, engage countries like Vietnam uh, in a productive way, in the basis of trade and cultural exchange. And if what you have to offer is good, they'll pick it up, at least eventually.
Yeah.
Rather than being dogmatic about it, um, just like Deng Xiaoping brought a pragmatic form of communism to China and propelled a recovery from a devastation, uh, we can bring a pragmatic approach to capitalism and approach countries like Vietnam that seem to be mm, fence sitting. Trump tried that with North Korea and it just didn't work. Trump tried the schmooze. He tried the, you know, lathering up the praise. He tried the person to person kind of a thing. He even brought Un down to Vietnam. Said, look at what pragmatic communism could do for your country. You could have this kind of an economy. But, I think Un likes to be number one. I think he's more selfish than nationalist.
Yeah.
So how do you how do you get through that? The incentives to people at the top are often different from what would be the incentives to the people of a as an entirety.
Yeah, certainly. I think stability has to be a big component. Um, Obviously, you've talked about free trade, openness, democratization sort of helps these things, certainly. But stability has to be a big one. You're just not going to attract foreign direct investment if there's going to be a regime change that could overhaul certain things. Every 5 years, companies just aren't going to put the FDI in. And I think it's almost, in some regards, when you look at countries like China, which are command and control economies, but are seen as more stable. I had a conversation with Professor Uma Kumbapati about this. We were discussing actually Indian indentured labor in the kind of periods, but we ended up talking about the Indian economy. And I ended up asking her why, you know, why China ended up being the manufacturing powerhouse of the world, and it grew to such like a large size when India and China in many regards had quite a lot of similarities geographically, access to ports, um, very large populations, and all this kind of stuff. And what she came to the conclusion was is that uh, well, uh, despite India being a democracy, which is usually typically it facilitates these things like free trade and stuff, because India was such a large country, administrating that democracy over a lot of regions when you don't have the institutions to be able to administrate it is incredibly difficult. Whereas in comparison to China, yes, it's a command and control economy, but they're transitioned into being much more free trade or more open to globalization, allow them to put certain things in place to sort of capture that. Now, India is certainly starting to catch up in certain things and is growing, which is obviously great as well. But I think confidence and the ability and stability obviously play like a massive role in whether a country is going to attract investment and then as a result grow economically.
Oh, India is a great success story. And it had moved from a democratic socialist country at independence to a country that is predominantly market oriented. Not as market oriented as Singapore,
Hmm.
but more so than the average country in the world. And we're seeing India growing at a faster rate than China,
Yep.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
noticeably faster rate. So we have a problem here of the tortoise and the hare.
Hmm.
So the tortoise, is slow moving. The hare can jump out. So a command and control economy has that ability. It has a formal method of leadership, whereas the true leader in a market oriented economy and democracy is one who inspires the people, mass numbers of people, to be confident because it's decentralized. Who's making the investment decisions? Well, in some sense, it's entrepreneurs and bankers.
Hmm.
In other words, hundreds, even thousands of different people, and they have to have confidence in their future. Well, that Modi brings that to India. I don't know if he's getting a little long in the tooth. Maybe we want some rotation in office. Maybe we want to see what is the next tier of leadership uh, in his party, the BJP.
Hmm.
Uh, or we want to see, how about the Congress Party? Are they going to become a liberal party and embrace markets in the context of liberal values? So, yeah, we'll see.
No, and I will say to your point, the China's current situation in regards to their housing market, and we've briefly touched on some of these ghost cities and ghost towns. And that's a real effect of command and control economies and not allowing capital to freely move as into where it's needed, and instead just essentially overbuilding and overcommitting on certain things. You could even maybe talk about their iron production as well, or the steel production, and how they've got like a just an overwhelming production of steel now that they're trying to offload to the rest of the world at basically cheap rates because they've kind of over indexed on steel production. And in fairness as well, to your point about becoming more free market and more global economies, India did have some of the most trade protectionist, tariff-based economies in anywhere in the world, and up until really recently, has really sort of cut down on sort of those tariff bases more and more and more. I literally just recorded an episode the other day where we were looking at the effects of Chinese imports on the Indian industry because tariffs have been cut down to such a degree. So, and as you mentioned, India is growing at an exceptionally fast rate. So, to your point, I think that in itself is great evidence for a lot of this trade openness and sort of globalization in regards to a lot of these things. To bring this sort of trade component back into sort of the war component, global sanctions are usually typically used by other countries to really sort of disincentivize war or encourage negotiation or whatever it might be. You see that in Russia, you see that in a multitude of other places as well. I was reading a book not too long ago called The Material World by Ed Conway. Great book. I really recommend everyone sort of read it. But in this, he basically talks about different materials that are basically sort of the foundation of our world. And he recalled an incident from World War One, actually, where during World War One, the British and the Germans actually had a secret trade agreement that was set up through Switzerland, where basically we would take glasses and lenses from Germany, and we would then, and in turn, we would provide Germany with rubber because they just couldn't get rubber in through the ports and from the sort of colonial economies. And the particular glasses and lenses we need for sort of binocular zoom things were only basically manufactured in Germany. So that despite there being, that's an example of, despite there being global sanctions and wars going on, the general need for, even back at that period of time, to have be open to trade globally for certain bits and pieces really just highlights actually you do need to have kind of these openness and these routes, and how important they are. And so I'm wondering, particularly as it relates to the Russia-Ukraine war, with how reliant Europe in particular is on Russian gas and energy, despite all this war going on and despite putting sanctions on Russia. How effective are global sanctions on limiting a wartime economy to operate?
Okay, so uh, we think that embargoes um, can work in the short run because they're disruptive. Now, the problem of Europe and energy is that they're suffering from that disruption just as the Russians are. In other
Right.
words, trade generally involves mutual benefit, and embargo usually involves mutual harm. Uh, the usual justification of embargo is we're hurting them more than they're hurting us. Uh,
Or you hope
that's
anyway.
yeah, you hope. But as we move on, we generally find other ways around. Now, the British during World War One imposed a pretty effective embargo on Germany, and so starved Germany into submission. I think the starvation was either as effective as the battlefield situation, or maybe more so. Yeah, there were millions of Germans suffering from lack of food, being susceptible to disease, and just dying from lack of food. And that really brought the war home. Um, Germany, following that, wanted Lebensraum. And in a way, that led to World War II.
Yeah.
So, getting back to why would a country as big as England, speaking of small countries like Singapore that have to commit to trade, why would a quote large country like England um, devote themselves to trade? Well, England's a island country. It's always been oriented to trade. Um, and with regard to relying on the Germans for some things and the Germans relying on the British for rubber from Malaysia, um, yeah, that's even large and middle-sized and large countries find advantages to trade. Protectionists around the world, including the new protectionists in Europe and the United States, they think we're a large country and we should, restore something from the past, make America manufacturing again.
Mm. Yeah, it's yeah.
Don't want those high-paying jobs in finance or in research-oriented health facilities or world-class uh, operating rooms. What's called health tourism is really big, or at least it used to be. Or the world's greatest universities that attract the best students from around the world. We don't want those jobs. We want manufacturing jobs. And you go to the factories, what do you find? They got robots. And so uh, present day manufacturing is not intensive in labor. Maybe certain kinds of countries like Bangladesh have labor intensive manufacturing, but that's reflecting their economic condition. So what we need is we need a low unemployment rate, which we have. Why are we protectionists when we have a low unemployment rate? And we need stable supply chains in the world. So actually, we don't have the British Navy anymore ruling the seas, right? We have the American Navy
Still pretty
ruling
good
the
navy.
yeah.
I think it is interesting in that regard. And there will obviously be some discourse as to the reason why some of these protectionism. I think I do find it strange because you mentioned there to have the importance of reliable, strong, needed supply chains. Because as I kind of mentioned earlier, you just even for a country as large as the United States, you just can't manufacture it or have the raw materials for absolutely everything. Even for as I mentioned with the telescopic scope and the glass example,
Right.
not all glass is the same. You can get lots of sand from Saudi Arabia. You can get certain, but there's different quality of sand just because you have one raw resource or something. He's even seeing that now with the talks around the Venezuelan oil stuff. Not all oil is the same because part of the reason why um, the Venezuelan oil is potentially important to the States is because they have the refineries dedicated to that type of oil. Not a lot of other countries do. Um, and what I find strange with a lot of the American trade protectionism that is going on recently, and I can understand to some degree wanting to shield yourself from China and the threats to some degree that the country is facing. But my imagination would at least in, lead me to believe that if you're going to do that, you'd want to do that as a coordinated effort amongst strong allies and build connections and supply chains with those strong allies. Countries like Canada, the UK,
Well,
Germany.
well, we'll leave Canada off, but yes, the Europe. So Canada needs to get up to the NATO standard of 2%. They can't defend their territorial waters. They don't have any working submarines, and
Oh,
the
so does
frigates
the
they
EU, by the way. So does the EU. That's theirs, but they've been
yeah,
long under.
Germany used to have some really good coastal defense submarines, and they let those things go. So we need to get up to the NATO standard. We need to, for every country or region to be primarily responsible for its place. With those kinds of partners, America becomes stronger. You look at these initiatives of Donald Trump here, there, and otherwhere, and elsewhere. I mean, I thought he was supposed to be the peace candidate. He's making one war after the next, but like little discrete wars. We'll go bomb them tonight, and it'll be over with, before breakfast.
Yeah, yeah. So no, it's an
but
interesting one.
but why we can do that is because the truth of the matter is, Europe is strong. Europe is way stronger than Russia. Uh, Now, I
Economically,
also
certainly speaking. And
economically, population-wise, and even if you do a hard count of conventional military force, Europe is stronger. Russia has nukes. We don't know if they'll get out of the silos,
hmm,
but they have nukes. Now, this
yeah.
guy Mark Rutte went to Trump and said, "You're going to put tariffs on us. We're going to put tariffs on you." And by being strong, even with your allies, you get respect. So uh, Trump changed his tune about Europe in Davos
Hmm.
after meeting with Mark Rutte, and I say great for him and the Europeans to stand up to their friends as well as to their potential enemies.
Well, and in fairness, I mean, you said the EU is maybe a little bit better in this regard, but I don't want to discount the UK and the EU in the sense that we have fallen behind in defense spending, and we've basically, and it wasn't necessarily well, intentional, quote unquote, but we've basically been living in this world in which it's been pretty much the smallest amount of conflicts globally for an extended period of time.
Yeah,
We've essentially been living off this peace dividend.
peace dividend, yes. And was this wrong? Let's do a little retrospective, okay? After the fall of the Berlin Wall, there were initiatives from Europe to Russia. We were thinking, Russia, you're making lots of money selling us oil and gas, and the Germans are rebuilding your trains. And we could just go into a lot of things about, hey, our future looks good together. We're going to make you an associate member of NATO. We're going to have these defense agreements like If we have any movement of troops, we're going to tell you, and you're going to tell us if you have any movements of troops. And we were thinking the, f- the future looks great. Is it wrong that we thought we had a peace dividend?
Mhm.
No, no, that's looking back with hindsight. I don't blame, I don't blame anybody for thinking, we don't need to have 2%. We didn't have a specific number back then, but we don't need a number like 2%, especially not the countries that are only regional. UK and France are members of the Security Council. Maybe they should have 2%. Actually, both of them kind of tiptoed around 2%.
Yeah,
You never really cut down below 2%, whereas Germany went down to like 1.3.
yeah. Yeah, it's particularly in an age where you have like an aging demographics, and there's a greater pulling on social care facilities. It's certainly
Oh,
a
yeah.
it's certainly a quick vice to say like, right, we're going to reduce defense spending and try and compensate for social policies in this time. But I think the truth is we're going to have to make some very tough decisions in the near future, considering how it's going in regards to, we probably do have to get back up to, 3, 4, 5% defense spending,
Ugh. Well,
acknowledging acknowledging the fact that the world is, in a different place now, and we probably can't rely on the peace
okay, so
dividend to the same
here's
degree.
what I say. Europe, and I don't really mean UK here, more the continental nations of Europe. Europe needs to assimilate its immigrants. So Europe doesn't have the population uh, mm, impossibility that Japan has. Europe brings in people, and look, we can revisit the issue of women. How many children on average women give birth to? Look at the Israeli women; they're outpacing the Israeli Jewish women. Now have a higher fertility rate than the Israeli Arab women.
Religious people tend to. I think this is typically uniform
Yes.
across whether you're Jewish, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Christian. Typically, more religious families tend to have more kids. Probably something to do
So,
with the
but I
doctrines of
think
the
that
religion.
we can look at these things. We could ask the question: are we m- enabling or encouraging, nudging our immigrants to assimilate? Now, what is the meaning of being British? Well, I don't think you ever really had a problem with race or color or nationality. I think anybody could. I think this is true that the Brits have this idea anybody can be British. Um, the Germans have recently embraced this idea. I think they think of German as a language and a culture, not as a skin color or a racial background. So yeah. Now
Yeah,
we in America, we're like a big experiment in this. Not that we got everything right from the start. We showed that a democracy can be multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and the Canadians, okay, well, I'll give them credit. They show you could be multilingual,
yeah, certainly. Yeah, well, they certainly do on that front. Um,
right?
yeah. So if you were, we've talked about various components of the research and the article that uh, you conducted here. Is there anything else that you would like to highlight, or is there like a key takeaway and finding
Oh,
from the article that you think people should really take home and resonate?
yes. So in looking at, what does this mean? What can we do about this? Okay, we thought that countries that are not pluralistic, countries that are monocultural, they should think strongly about forming states or even semi autonomous regions so the minorities of those countries could have a place where they can prosper. And we could have like defense agreements and trade agreements so we can nevertheless cooperate with each other. On the other hand, I think the United States, I think we're home free on this, that we can be a multicultural country.
Hmm, certainly.
So federalism. federalism in a broad sense.
Yeah, no, no, certainly. And is there any materials that, in regards to military's impact on the economy, economic growth, war, are there any key materials, like any books, any key research other than the ones that you have yourself that you would point people to if they really want to understand the military and impact on war and the
Oh,
economies across the globe?
so this article that I wrote on war and economic growth, it was kind of an introduction. I've written about certain wars here and there, like the US Mexican War of the early 19th century, but not in a systematic way. So I find this very interesting. And yes, uh, I think most work on war is not systematic. You read four historians about the same war, you come to four different conclusions. Um, Econometric work is kind of very narrow. You need lots of data, and you only can test, at most a handful of hypotheses. And history is a lot more messy than that. So I understand the historical problem involved, but yeah, I'm just getting my feet wet with regard to war and the economy. In the past, we used to skip the war. Like if we had an if we had an economic investigation of this versus that, we'd have like the years before World War II, and then we'd just skip over World War II and tie in, let's say, the 1950s. So no, war's part of the human experience. It's really awful to say that.
No, absolutely, certainly, and I think it's important to more recognize more of these factors and consider more of the, particularly in potentially where we're going as a global society into the future is going to become more and more prevalent. I guess actually just one final question, honestly, before we sort of wrap up here. I noticed particularly early on, in regards to the Ukraine-Russian war, that I was hearing a lot of reports that, oh, the Russian economy is failing, it's really struggling, it's declining in its growth rate. But then after a year, after 2 years, I start to see reports about, oh, actually, Russia has transitioned itself effectively into a wartime economy and is
Right.
actually starting to grow and develop to some extent. Now, given the stuff that's going on in the news at the moment, I'm not sure when we can really put a pin in when the Russia-Ukraine war will potentially end. But how do you see Russia's economy post-war? Is this move to a wartime industrial economy something that it can capitalize upon and grow and develop post-war? Or is it something that's really representing a balloon in the economic figures that is essentially going to pop?
So I see a lot of potential in a post-war Russia. I think Russia has certain strengths, and I think can these strengths can be reinforced. For example, development of the economic potential of the Arctic,
Hmm.
sending oil and natural gas to China and not just to Europe. And I also think that Russia has always had a tremendous scientific minds. Something about Russia brings forth, great philosophers, writers, performers, athletes, yeah, and scientists. So yeah, this war is just awful. It's um, destroying Russia, but Russia has a history of this. Russia, you can't invade it. Every invader has lost,
Hmm.
and they can't fight at the periphery. They've lost one after another war at the periphery. They lost to Poland in 1920. They lost to Japan in 1904. They lost in Afghanistan. That was just prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now, well, they're not winning in Ukraine. It's a war of attrition. I'm not sure anybody is winning. I appreciated Trump saying, let's just stop the fighting. Yeah, I thought, that makes a lot of sense. I might complain about the details, but stopping the fighting is very important. But, that didn't happen. And now I think Trump has had it with
Mhm.
Putin. I
No,
think
certainly.
Trump doesn't like being played by Putin. And yeah, I think the only way Russia is going to lose is to lose. I mean, the only way this war is going to end is by one or the other country. Let me be a little bit neutral here.
Hmm.
Is going to lose.
Yeah, it's going to be. Yeah, it's an awful situation, and I mean, all we can really hope for is that it finishes relatively soon, and both parties are able to spring off the back of it, and hopefully develop economies and societies that start to flourish, obviously in the near future. Clifford, this has been great. I've really really enjoyed this
Yeah, thank you.
conversation. Thank you very much for your time. I really really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.